say that.
Justin.
Why does he say that out loud?
Kyle came through like it was 35 seconds.
Oh,
They
okay.
can look at this iPad.
Okay, you tell me when, Mitch, we're ready. We're good, okay. Welcome back to our work meeting for the 27th. We have one item left. We're gonna get through it in 3 minutes.
Got it.
Riveting.
Secondary water infrastructure planning. Justin.
Got it. So I've heard a lot of banter that is standing in the way of everyone going home, so we'll see. All right. So there was a lot of information in the staff report, so I apologize for that, but we wanted to try and provide as much as we could. And so we'll go through here and try and go through the slides. Obviously, we can stop at any one of them and discuss any further. Doesn't want to move.
It's slow, remember, you gotta give it a minute.
So I turn it off and on and see if that'll give us space. There we go. All right, so a little bit of background and then a little bit about what we'll talk about. In March of this year, the council discussed the Olympia Hills and removing that secondary requirement within that development. Since that decision, obviously, several of our other development partners have come in and expressed their desire and interest in obviously going that same route. So we started looking into different options about expanding the secondary system and what impacts that might have. So we'll go through and review some of the scenarios that were in your packet, look at the water supply costs and compared to infrastructure costs, impacts to culinary water, and then review those alternatives and then hopefully get some direction on which option we want to move forward with. So just to explain, you'll see this similar slide going through as we look through each scenario. So I'll just kind of identify a few things. So the bolded lines are the capital infrastructure that is in our current master plan. And this is scenario 2, which we're using as a baseline. So this scenario has removed the Kennecott area and the Olympia area as far as infrastructure goes and water demands. And so this is the remaining infrastructure. And then there's a small piece of down here. So the bold lines are capital infrastructure. The small black lines, the thin black lines are infrastructure that's currently existing. And then the dark bolded black lines are what is eliminated in each one of these scenarios. So this scenario 2, like I said, is the baseline. You can see down in the table, we've highlighted the costs of infrastructure for culinary secondary and the total cost there. And you kind of compare those scenarios with each other. We'll focus mainly on scenarios 3 and 4 as alternatives. Scenario 1 was our baseline, the scenario prior to removing Kennecott and Olympia. We figured we didn't need to show that, but we have it in the table so you can see what the impacts of those capital costs were through each scenario. Scenario 3, similar to scenario 2, the only difference is you can see the Wasatch area is removed. That one is somewhat significant because of the amount of infrastructure it takes to get there and the number of homes it will serve or the areas it will serve. And you can see the amount of capital costs that it would save on secondary compared to scenario 2, and we'll go through those comparisons a little bit. But that's really the main difference between scenario 2 and 3. Scenario 4 expands on that reduction and removes secondary from all new development moving forward. As you can see, the main areas is going to be down here because this is where the least amount of building is, and then you see a few more areas up, scattered throughout the north part of the city. So we'll move through the scenario comparisons. As we said, we're comparing to scenario 2 as at the baseline. And what these tables are showing is on the top table, comparing scenario 2 to scenario 3. What we've talked about in the past is if we remove secondary, that obviously has impacts to the culinary system, and we've identified those potential impacts. So as you can see, scenario 3 would increase the culinary system by about $1.8 million for upsize, mostly pump stations and water tanks. You will have some pipeline upsizes that may need to happen. you'll remove $16 million worth of capital secondary infrastructure, leaving a net total of about $14 million of savings by not installing secondary, essentially down in the Wasatch area. Scenario 2. In comparison to scenario 4, you can see there's a more significant impact to the culinary system, about $7.5 million. But you have a cost savings of secondary of a little over 63 million, leaving a net of 55 million, a little over $55 million of capital infrastructure savings. We took that and then compared that to what the increased culinary water costs would be for each one of those scenarios. I will say in this figure, this is a little different than your staff report. These scenarios with capital improvements and project distribution improvements. Let me describe what that is. So the project distribution system is essentially through the subdivisions. It's not the capital infrastructure, but it's essentially what the developers would have to install to service those individual developments. Now, those costs can vary widely depending on densities, depending on, how much infrastructure needs to be installed, the number of connections. That ranges typically from 40 to 60% of the capital costs. And so we just picked 50% to try and give an order of magnitude so you can see this number. There was a miscalculation in our formula. This used to be about 132 million. What it was doing is it was doubling some of the costs. And so as going through here, so instead of being 132 million, it's 87, which is still a substantial number. And the same thing with down here. I think this was around 36 million in your packet, but this table shows kind of what the increased water costs would be and how long it would take to overcome the capital costs.
We should point out, though, this does not include the capital replacement.
Yeah,
as
item
it
2
calls out
there. This does not include, as Nathan alluded to, capital replacement. Now, pipelines are typically 75 years is typically what we have in the master plan as far as when we need to start planning to replace those pipelines.
Okay.
Pump stations and tanks have, how they're built and maintained, typically that 75 to 100 year, and pump stations, are typically around a 40 to 50 year replacement. Now, there's a lot of, maintenance and replacement of pumps, but the buildings themselves are typically 50 to 60 years. So you can see 30 years out before we recoup those funds with those increased culinary water costs, but then 30 years after that, you'll have to start planning for capital replacement of all this infrastructure. Scenario 3 I put on here, it's about 500 acre feet of additional water that's going to be, supplied by the culinary system that's not going to be supplied by a secondary if we don't expand into that Wasatch area, and roughly 1,900 acre feet per year if we go with scenario 4. So that kind of gives you a rough idea of how many acre feet. Now, that's not a huge impact. I mean, right now we're going through about 10,000 acre feet per year total to serve the city. So you can see by removing secondary in those, expanding development areas, I mean, it is a large impact, but it's 20% of what we're currently doing right now. So as we build out, if you're comparing that to the 25,000 acre feet that we're gonna need to build out, it's not a lot of water, but it is substantial.
So with that capital, if we put the capital replacement in, that would move those numbers
Correct.
farther out.
Yeah, it would
20 years
move
out,
them
because you-
way out here, right? I mean, if you start having to save money for capital replacement, those costs would, start pushing out 40, 50, 60 years even further.
Not trying to understand this.
But so for that piece, if you have to maintain one line, say a 24-inch line, because you upsize it for culinary, there's a cost to replace that. If you have two 16-inch lines, right, the same amount of water, now you have 2 lines to replace. You have to maintain that. It's not going to be.
I totally
the same
understand
price.
that. I'm just not understanding
So,
what this graph is trying to communicate to me
so
here.
culinary water, let me see if I can explain it, maybe I'll get it wrong. Culinary water costs more than
Sure.
secondary water for treatment. I think this is trying to show by the savings from your capital, not doing the capital, and paying more for water, by 2060, without including capital replacements, and if all assumptions remain the same and things grow and that differential remains the same, in 2060, you would now flip over and secondary might have been cheaper, right? You're all O&M, you're paying more in scenario.
So,
I guess that's what I'm trying to understand, and because intuitively it sounds like you're saying, if we have just culinary water, there's less capital replacement costs. If we have secondary water, there's more replacement costs.
That's not shown on this chart.
Yeah, that's what, again, I'm just trying to intuit here why the assumption is somehow that secondary water is more affordable over time. I guess I'm just trying, the delta between those two lines doesn't seem like it would be as much if that capital replacement is included in the plans.
It would not. The what you're seeing here is just that, was it about 15% difference between an acre foot of treated water versus an acre foot of
Got
secondary.
it, compounded over.
Yes.
Okay, got it.
Assuming all that remains the same, as you spread it out.
Okay,
That's a pretty big assumption.
yeah, and it's not assuming that the water rate would stay exactly the same over those years, or did you build in an increment?
So this is included, and that's why it starts climbing more quickly at the end, is water costs are getting more expensive. So this is taking annual increase of Jordan Valley into,
Average annual increase?
yes, yeah, it's an average. And we used their average of 5% is what they kind of build into their modeling. So this was something that wasn't in your packet, but thought it'd be easier to kind of explain here. So each one of these scenarios, this is kind of identifying the main impacts to the culinary system. They're somewhat similar between all of them. You know, here we have some pump stations and pipelines that need to be upsized or need to be adjusted. You'd see 1,200 gallons a minute on this pump station and 500 gallons a minute. Now, these aren't built yet, and so we have the opportunity to have the, make these changes and adjustments. In scenario 3, you can see I tried to identify the ones that are kind of italicized and underlined are projects that we're currently designing and for construction. These are the East Herriman infrastructure, zone 2 and 3 pump stations, and the East Herriman tank, zone 3 tank. So if we did scenario 3, the pump station, zone 2 pump station would have to increase by about 800 gallons a minute. Zone 3 pump station, about 1,600 gallons a minute. And then there's some, throughout the system, some upsize of some master plan transmission distribution. When you're looking at scenario 4, you have those same improvements to the pump stations, but the flow increases substantially. And then we need some additional storage in the zone 3 tank. We have a zone 4 pump station that we need to increase in North Herriman, and those are future East Herriman pump station, and then upsize the master plan lines as well.
And those those ones, the 3 and 4, because we're just going through the process right now, that's more immediate money right now, so those changes need to be put in now.
So yes, if we choose scenario 3, we'd have to go back and adjust these pump stations. Now, we wouldn't necessarily equip them at the build out. We would equip them to last 10 or 15 years, kind of the life of a pump, but we'd build the structure itself large enough to handle these increased flows.
Same like the capacity of the tank.
Correct. So we'd likely build the same capacity that we're planning on now. And then in 10 years, we'd have to upsize them to handle these increased flows. Yeah. The tank is a little, on scenario 4, the tank is a little more questionable, whether we build a separate 700,000 gallon tank, or we'd want to just include that in the current design we are now. Where it's currently being built, there's not really opportunity for a tank farm, if you say. So in the future, if we need to add 700,000 gallons, it's not easy to build one next to the one we're looking at building now. We could build it in another location. The other option would be to obviously go back, redesign the one we're currently looking at to include that extra storage.
The pump stations lend themselves to being designed to expand much more easily than a tank.
Tank,
So just kind of giving a little detail on each one of these scenarios. So option one is scenario two, really no change. We'll just continue to work through the current master plan. You know, we'll service current dry pipes and plan on moving into new development, expanding a new development. Option two, scenario three is essentially proceed with the master plan, but remove the secondary requirement in the Wasatch South Hills development, similar to the Olympia. And option three in scenario four is to just serve dry pipes and do not expand into new development areas. So we tried to outline some of the next steps. This might not be everything we need to do, but if we choose option one, our master plan is pretty much there. We just need to finalize it, complete an impact fee facility plan. Option two, we need to update the master plan to reflect the changes in the Wasatch area. We may need to look at amending Wasatch's MDA and any pertinent city codes that require secondary in all areas. Option three, we would definitely need to go back and amend city code for sure, because it requires it throughout. And then we may need to look at MDAs to see if that language is there. Once any of the updates, whichever scenario we choose, once the updates to the plans are made and capital infrastructure is identified, then we can move on and finalize the water rate study. And then the other thing is, whichever scenario we look at, we'll need to evaluate our current water right assets and try and maximize their use moving forward. We have some thoughts I have some thoughts and ideas on how to do that. We briefly spoke, Sherry and I, a little bit earlier today. But that's not a deal breaker. That's something that, look to be creative no matter what we're doing. And so I think we can overcome those things pretty easily. So, and I think that's it. So essentially, if we feel like we have an option and want to move forward, obviously we'd like to have some decision so that we can work through. We have developers that are asking. We'd like to finalize the master plan so that we can finish the rate study, which we know is in need. Right. But any questions, discussion?
The only real question I wrote down is what you just alluded to, is if we choose one of the options and to move away from expanding the secondary system, what do we do with our sources? Right, so the one graph of we rely more on Jordan Valley and our sources just kind of end. We still have wells, we still have shares, etc. What are some of the options that you've been?
So the secondary water shares that we currently own, we own more than we need because we've been planning for the future. If we go with scenario 4 and continue to serve our dry pipes, I think we will be utilizing close to what we own. We may have a little bit more, we may have a little bit less, but I think we're fairly close to that number. We haven't overly purchased Bobby Jacobs shares and Canal shares. I think we're probably fairly close. We did anticipate as the secondary system grew that we would take our existing wells and convert them to secondary, and then can utilize Jordan Valley for more indoor water. So that's where we'd have to get creative and try and understand how would we utilize those sources. We could just continue to utilize them. Right now we're blending with Jordan Valley water. Obviously as you know, our wells have hard water, high TDS levels, but as we blend that, as we continue to use more Jordan Valley water, if we still use those same wells, we'll just use more Jordan Valley water, which means we'll probably likely be able to blend a little bit more, reducing the total overall TDS levels in the water. So we could still continue to use our existing sources, but we do have obviously, we could look at treating our wells to improve the water quality, so we continue to utilize our full assets, those types of things. We just completed a treatment study on 2 of our wells to try and provide some information. Nathan and I haven't had a chance to look at that yet, but we'll bring that to you at some future date so you can look at that and understand what those costs are. But so we do have options to utilize our existing sources. It just may cost more, but obviously other water sources are going to cost more. So.
Yeah, and it's even beyond cost more, it's like if we say we're gonna be more and more heavily dependent on Jordan Valley, there's nothing that says Jordan Valley has to give us water. You know, that's the thing to always remember, it's not just that you have to give this so you can request it as much, it's like, there's a finite resource there too, that they have to say, well, this is how much we can give you, or you play block 2 race like Olympians, those types of things, because you can't just guarantee, okay, it's not like widgets, right? We can't just make more of them, so we can become more heavily dependent on them if that's allowed and contract with them.
Nathan made a good point a little bit earlier today when he and I were chatting, was actually that, you know, we can't foresee what our long-term water use is going to be. We don't know what our long-term water demands. People are gonna use water differently in 20 and 40 years. So our long-term planning gives us an idea, but we don't really know what that's gonna look like, right?
Let's build out all kinds of stuff.
So, you know, the less water there is, people just have to use less water overall. And there may be new technologies, or you might be able to utilize those irrigation shares that once went into a secondary system. You might be able to treat that same water and use it in a culinary system, right? So there's a lot of options in the future.
Well, and there's like different avenues for funding and stuff like that too. I always come back to, no matter which avenue you use for funding, it still comes out of the taxpayer's pocket. So I hate it when we talk about, oh, but there's money here, money here, money here. It just means it's all our money anyway. But there are different avenues for funding, different projects and things like that. The Great Salt Lake, anything that we're doing in Health Reserve now, there's funding there. There's a bunch of different pockets of funding. The question is just which direction we want to go. Try and look for different funding to try and help us through. It's a lot of money.
So you need direction from us tonight at all?
Well,
Or it's just
direction, or, you know, if you wanna think about it and come back. Like I said, our water rate study is somewhat dependent on this. When we presented the water rate study before, there were questions on how much of this future capital cost is going to secondary. We haven't made a decision on that, so we wanna understand what those impacts are.
Yeah.
And so just be able to move forward to the water rate study, but obviously we need to make the right decision here as well, so.
And you're gonna get a reimbursement agreement coming fairly, I think maybe the next meeting, because we have several lines that go through 6400 through Olympia that do not serve their project, but would serve secondary. We need to understand, are we moving forward with those and how are we doing that?
Yeah,
So-
Ryan brought that up.
So there's some of these items are starting to become pressing.
And that's a $700,000?
That's about $700,000, and I think those would still, in scenario 4, those are still used, cause those just loop our dry system.
They loop the dry system. The one thing they do, we may adjust the size a little bit. I don't know. The sizes will need to be really adjusted, but if we're not serving new development that way, I think we looked at that scenario as scenario 2, where we're not expanding into Olympia, so we've downsized those pipes already. The other thing is the Wasatch and Rosecrest, they're bringing in MDAs, their pit includes secondary water. So those decisions will be impacted as well.
Sure. Yeah, we need to, even the water rate study, we need to start making a decision because we need to catch up on that.
Do we wanna give our thoughts then, Steve? Do you wanna, what do you about on this?
You know, people ask me questions all the time about, you know, what's the right decision for a business, what's the right decision for a financial thing, blah, blah, blah. And the answer I always give is it depends, right? It depends on what your goals are, it depends on what it is that you're trying to achieve. If our goal is to save money over the next 30 years, that we're gonna invest in other infrastructure, makes sense. Don't invest in the secondary water and use that money to pay for other infrastructure, right? It's $40 million savings. But we also know that down the road then, there's increased cost. There's a cost of doing business that way, right? If the goal is to conserve water, the paying higher rates tends to limit use, and there's opportunities there, right? So I guess it's hard for me to give clear, definitive type of feedback in the absence of understanding what our overarching goal is. Does that make sense? I tend to lean towards the idea that if we can save money on capital costs and encourage water conservation, that's two pretty good wins, which is what's kind of shaped my opinion about moving forward with secondary water anyway, right? Like, make people pay for the culinary rates and, I was facetiously joking with the mayor earlier that, there's almost this conversation that happens about secondary water, like, no, it's not real water, it's just secondary water. I don't wanna use real water to water my lawn, I'll just use the secondary water to water my lawn, as if it's not water, like it's not a limited resource that we have in the state. And, I make the case that I think there will have to be technological advances that could treat secondary water and use it for culinary purposes, or reuse culinary water. That's probably the more likely scenario, but down the road, because there's not enough water to do all the things that need to be done. We have to find ways to reuse water and be more efficient with the water, and it might end up being that water reuse ends up the irrigation stuff, and we use the same water twice. So, I've generally been leaning towards not wanting to continue to grow out the secondary water system. I think I'm probably still leaning in that direction, but I still ask the question, what is it that we most want to achieve that would help me solidify whether or not I want to cling to that point.
Good non-answer.
No, I'm generally leaning towards it, but again, it's, there's pros and cons to every decision we make.
Right.
And we should understand if the pros that we're getting are worth the cons that we're getting too, right? And if the pros are what we want to achieve and they're aligned with what our long-term goals are, then that's what we should do.
Yeah, I am 100% understand and agree with this, absolutely. And I understand the urgency of this, but I would also ask maybe in 2 weeks to really come back and look at this again, just because of my own digestion of some of the information. Cause some of the graphs I was a little bit confused about too, and I have some other people I'd like to ask more questions about with this. And I don't disagree with technology, I mean, I know, some of our wells and stuff, you gotta come through an RO system, we can't just come through an RO system, and there's discharge, and there's this, and there's all this cost associated with it. And it'd be nice to reuse water, but you can't because it has to go to the Great Salt Lake, so our region has a lot of complexity that some other people don't have to deal with the same, reuse water and stuff is much more complex in our area because of the lake. And access to water, like I was even saying before, it's like, Jordan Valley doesn't have to sell us more water. When you have several entities, several people they supply water to, and at some point there's only one jug. It's like, who puts in the next straws, how many straws, and then I hear today about 25,000 more homes there, and that land is all non-water conversion land, right? Now, I know Kennecott has some water rights and things like that too, but that water doesn't convert equally either. Secondary water, an acre foot of secondary water doesn't equal an acre foot of culinary water. There's a loss in that, and there's a substantial cost in treating water. So, it's just becomes much more complex than it seems like it should be, right? And I don't disagree. I do believe that we're seeing a shift in the attitude you just referred to, because I definitely believe that was the attitude. I think the shift in legislation about putting meters on, those types of things, have started people to become aware that it doesn't matter if it's secondary, AKA non-treated water, or if it's treated water, it's a finite resource and you better be careful with it, right? So I think there's a shift in that. I believe that because we see a shift even in our usage pattern of the district. We've seen, not people go crazy this year, and they could have because there was enough water, right? We're back to a normal supply of water. I'm not suggesting we're all the way out of the drought, even though some people think about different things. But we're seeing maybe a habit change, which would be better, because even if you have a good water year for the next 2 or 3 years, eventually you're gonna have bad water years, and if people don't start adjusting to the fact that you live in an arid desert, then you're gonna be in trouble, right?
I keep asking, what happens if we have another 500-inch snow year?
Yeah, it'd be great. 'cause
Those
then that-
reservoirs are going to be overflowing.
But, and then if you think about different areas of our city, like, what do you think, South Hills, we went up, whatever. Anyway, it's like, some of that area is topography, mountainous, maybe there'll be far less, maybe smaller lot, and we have our conservation standards in there, so then it's like, is it necessary, does it warrant the cost of putting into certain areas? So, I think that it's a pretty complex about some of that, and I just want a chance to digest it a little bit more, and I certainly don't need to delay it, cause I think that the water rate issue, I think we gotta get on top of that as quick as possible. I also believe in this fairness to development partners in our community. If they're saying, hey, you did that for this guy, we want to move forward on these things, we'd like to see that, how that's in we owe them an answer too. I believe that that's only fair, an expedient answer, not a rushed answer would make a bad decision, but I think an answer where we feel like it's fully vetted this information. And thank you, I really appreciate that, because the biggest thing to me was, but there is a cost that's associated from switching off secondary to go full culinary. And there's some costs that maybe you can't even calculate, so no crystal ball, I don't know, I can't find mine either. But anyway, those are some of my comments.
Come back in 2 weeks? Or do you want to,
My 2 cents is the same as it kind of has been in previous meetings. I appreciate all the information. Yes, 2 weeks and all of this. I met with Nathan yesterday and had lots of questions for him on the numbers and the graphs and some things are included, not. I always try to explaining complicated processes and procedures to my clients and help them make a decision. So I always try to separate things to their basis form, right? To me, this is, at the core of this, the main decision is for what direction we want to go with the development of the rest of the city, right? And you can look at the numbers already, right? Go look at the legislative thing in the packet there, and it says that our housing right now today is 50-50, right? 50 is multifamily. Our definition is attached housing, right? So think about the density that's townhouses at the largest size, right? And so on. We have the new landscaping standards. So my point with that is half the city already, and the majority of what's being built in the areas we're talking about, there's very little individual landscaping to be watered with secondary. So, without digging into all the numbers, just on the surface trying to separate that, we have dry pipes in the ground for a lot of the existing areas that do have, yards and gardens and things and that's why I keep asking about sources, right? So if those are in the ground, do we have the sources to provide it to those? Does it make sense to keep building out the system for what's already in the ground? To me, that's a separate question from, do we continue with
I agree.
the new stuff? And is it, I guess where I'm going with this, the question is it needed for the new stuff? Is it beneficial enough? Is the demand enough in the new stuff to warrant the cost of building a parallel system to deliver a drop of water?
that's where,
And do. Gut check, I don't think it is, right? Just anecdotal, right? I don't necessarily have the science with it, but I think, but you raise another important question. I think it's something we need to understand is what costs still remain to complete the system that exists, right? When the
Now you're
lines are already
complicating
there. No, but
That's a separate question.
it's
Do we
another
continue?
there's a whole nother layer of question is,
How far
like
do we
if we've
take
already
that?
got, we've got dry lines put in a lot of places, and, what do we have to still build to
That's in here.
construct to get that
That's in
stuff
here, yeah.
completed?
That's your scenario 4.
scenario 4, 67 million.
So that's a 67 million, so I guess my question of that is
That's the question I
it
don't have an
63
answer.
million in savings, or is there more of that 67 million that can be saved?
But
Right, I mean, let's
So
just
you
go,
say
with-
we don't-
we're
we
just
don't- we don't
abandoning
ever-
secondary water as an option. We don't wanna do that anymore. We don't wanna spend any more money on it. We don't wanna build parallel systems. We don't wanna build any more extra tanks. We don't wanna run any more lines. We don't wanna buy any more rights. We don't wanna do anything associated with secondary water from here on out. How does that impact that number? I'm assuming it's pretty significant, right? The question is, how does that impact all these decisions that we're making, infrastructure we already have, stuff we bonded for, how does it impact all that?
So if we don't do this, this number gets a lot larger. And there's existing infrastructure that would have to be, substantial
We've
infrastructure
got
that would have
enough
to change.
size, right?
Well, if I'm looking at the difference between, 16 million savings leaves the 1.8 increase, 63 is a 7.5.
Still 55 million savings.
Yeah, I mean, if you went to 120 million savings or 100 million savings, you'd probably have 15 or 20 million dollars.
Yeah, so that,
Right, yeah.
So this doesn't.
I recognize that's gonna go up, yeah. But I think you still get 100 million in savings instead of 55 million in savings.
So that's what I'm saying is I think if we can separate the decisions, if that's possible. To me, the decision on the new stuff, I'm leaning towards, I don't know that it makes sense. I haven't seen any data that tells us we should continue. So to answer the question for the developers, putting things in, I'm just not seeing anything that supports that part of it.
Yeah.
And then I think it's a separate question of what do we do with the existing? Do we go cold turkey, we'll maintain what we currently have, but we aren't gonna expand it anymore? Then what do we do with our water rights and wells to offset the other, or do we continue to build it, or is there somewhere in between?
Yeah,
I
it'd almost be like you need,
To me, that's a lot
4
more.
scenarios for the 67 million.
Yeah, just
Not
for
to
the
give you any more
existing-
work, just.
Just for that existing, I think there's a
Can't
lot of
have that
different
by
scenarios.
next 2 weeks.
No, that's right. You can come with 2 scenarios.
Yeah, but I think too, if you think about, sorry, I don't mean to take your.
No.
But if you think about, a $60 million savings or $70 million savings, and you put it towards something that, treats our own wells or treats our own supply, so that we don't be completely dependent even more so on Jordan Valley, which I'm their rep, I love Jordan Valley, they do a great job, but I think that we also,
That's interesting.
it's any portfolio, diversification is always better, right? And so if you thought about maybe taking some of those cost savings that you would have and putting them towards a project that would increase your own internal supply by treating your own wells or something like that, then that starts to make a little bit more sense to me.
I'd be curious to understand that too. I mean, if that's
Obviously,
you can save $100 million
I-
and it costs $30 or $40 million to build a treatment plant or something like that.
It won't, it'll cost me.
I know, it's gonna cost more than we would say, we're
Everybody
probably,
can
yeah.
Well,
head spin how much it'll cost.
Water treatment's a lot cheaper than wastewater treatment, so.
It's true.
It's still, that's the difference between an outrageous amount of money
And a lot of money.
a lot of money, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, so I mean, those kind of things would be something we could consider as still trying to be good stewards of our water resources, but trying to find ways to diversify our supply and really heavily promote conservation, which Justin and his team, I mean, they were the leaders in that, in my opinion, for
Right.
for the cities doing that, just to try and really figure out ways to really focus on that, so. I didn't ask for Teddy, is he still there?
Teddy, thoughts?
Yeah, it's.
That says it all.
Yeah, we're all in the same place, Teddy. Well said.
I agree with every statement put in there, and it's a tough decision. It's like Steven said, if we stop and abandon everything 100% now, where do we sit? What complexity does that look like? I don't want to do that. I like the option 3 or 4 better, but option 3, you're going to have those one-offs, like Sherry says. You're going to have that. You did it for this guy, you got to do it for me. So any future development or any future MDAs, PIDs, we'll see that in. And a lot of those are future build-outs, and they're complex projects in its own that we know of, the current ones. And then obviously the cost that it increases the culinary system of already infrastructure if we do stop everything. So I'm leaning more towards that option 3 currently, and then take the one-offs as they come in. But that's kind of where I'm basing that off. So
So are you guys okay with the 2-week ask, just because it just to have a few more questions I wanna ask a few other people about.
How does that affect the decision with Ryan? Do we still need to move forward with that
It'll be
reimbursement?
on that next meeting, and so, I think that's something we need to figure
So
out.
we can look and see if there are impacts. The water lines still need to run through there. And if scenario 4 down decreases those sizes, we've already decreased them substantially already. You're talking percents of dollars, right? On if we reduce a pipe from a 12 to a 10. Say we install a 12 and we only need a 10 in the future, you're talking, the dollar amount difference is not substantial there, so. I
It's
mean,
not the difference between not doing it all.
Correct.
It's
I
not a
think-
700,000.
Yeah, so we could, it's a small percentage of that 700,000, so, I mean, we could move forward with the plan we have now, and the financial impacts would be very minimal if we had to go back small, if we had to go smaller, we just install larger pipes, it's not that substantial, so I think we could move forward with the 6400 West project, and with.
So am I right to understand that we're asking for 3 pipes to be installed? 2 of them are secondary pipes and 1 of them is culinary pipe?
Correct, and none of them will serve Olympia.
Right.
So the culinaries needs to go through,
course.
it's, really, we're talking
Right,
about
we
the 2
got
secondary.
we got to provide culinary, it's the kind of what would be the decision as to culinary or the secondary lines.
So the secondary lines would be, they're to provide connectivity to our secondary system, but they also will provide water to existing infrastructure on the north side, like some areas in Teton Ranch and potentially that, 40-acre park and the park that's in the 7-acre park, it's in Olympia. They're needed for those types of things. Is connectivity and feeding existing infrastructure.
And those are the hard ones to walk away from when you think about a huge regional
40-acre
park.
Yeah.
It's hard to walk away from secondary access to those types of facilities unless you're gonna turf them all, you know what I mean? 'Cause it's.
That's the idea.
Right, but I'm just saying that.
But there's still a lot of other landscaping on it.
Yeah, so that's hard when there's a cost difference, a huge cost difference out there, cause
And-
that's block 2 rates.
Teton, that whole area, that's 300 acres of homes.
And
A
large
number of
lots.
those are large. They're the only remaining larger lots to be
Yeah.
built. So it's not like, it's not a decision of don't put it in or do put it in. It's, they're gonna put something in, what size is it?
Right.
Maybe you can use those deadlines for fiber.
There you go.
Right next, you said that to me.
Oh, you did?
That's exactly what Ryan said.
That's funny.
Okay, so 2 weeks, are you okay coming back?
Yeah, and do you want more presented or just more discussion?
I think you've done
Yeah, I
your
think-
job, I just, and I apologize, I read it, but I just wanted a little bit more time to just really understand and hear this conversation and then decide.
Obviously, feel free to reach out if you have questions about things as you move forward.
So I don't think you need new staff report or anything, just come back, same thing, we'll give you a head.
Cause that meeting might have been a little bit shallow, we wanna make sure it's longer.
Okay.
Okay, we need to go
Sorry
into
for
close
starting
then?
early.
Nope, no close then?
Motion to adjourn the city council work meeting.
All in favor?
Aye.
Wow, alright. Job.
Is that clock right?
Lights drop.
Okay,
Let's
it's
drop.
11:08 or 8:11.
Yeah, I mean, I've got 4 at home next to my desk.
Let's start first.